Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you guys are at. Hope you're having a fantastic day. It's SoulSaint here, and I wanted to talk to you guys about something that's coming up very soon. Very, very soon. It's actually a lot sooner than I was expecting. We are going to get the Epic Empowerment, which we did a little bit of a talk about with their roadmap that's coming up for Raid and what we're going to be getting in the foreseeable future, along with some of those quality of life buffs. It's actually happening a little bit sooner than I was expecting. But I got asked a question, and the question was, what epics should I empower? And I thought about it at first, and I said this on my streams, that like I had like a blanket statement, like, oh, you automatically want to do these because these guys are still used. And although that is true, I had to reel it back in because there was particularly someone in my clan was talking about some things that I wanted to point out that may be worthwhile for you guys to consider. So, for anybody who may be new to the game, or if you're, kind of out of the loop in terms of what's going on, empowerment is basically you're taking duplicate champions, with the exception of some of the ones you see on the screen right now for legendaries, and you empower them. Basically, you feed them into one of them, and what you get from it is that for each dupe that you feed into one particular champion, and basically you awaken them a tier, they get a certain amount of stat values that go up to a total of 40% for the primary stats like HP, defense, and attack, along with some extra accuracy, resistance, speed, crit rate, and crit damage. Now, for the epics, I actually do have a screenshot of what it looks like when it's fully empowered, and I wanted to show you guys this on screen. So, compared to your legendary empowerment, it's pretty much the same for your base stats, so the HP, attack, and defense are still 40%, like how you see in the screenshot, as well as in-game. Let's go back to it real quick. For a total, this is at rank 4, so there's going to be pretty much some spaces in between. But in addition to that, you're also going to notice that the speed, although you are getting some, it's a little bit less than what you would get for a legendary. So instead of getting a full 15 for Legos, or that you would get for epics, you would only get 10 instead. So 5 less. In addition to that, you also get 5% crit rate, so way, way less comparatively to your Legos as well, by 5%. And then also half of that for crit damage, so 15% versus 30%. So I wanted to start there to give you guys like a visual. I'm actually going to leave this up on the screen so you guys can take a look at it and see it. As of right now, here's the pros and cons of it. And this is where I'm going to kind of decide, for me, how I'm going to approach it. A lot of it, first and foremost, I'll be real with you, it's the FOMO, being able to show like a bunch of +4s in terms of epics that I have dupes of, would be a glamorous quality of life measure to brag about. There's bragging. There's a little kudos in there that I would say that automatically is an essential. That's a pro. The cons, though, is something that I kind of wanted to kind of bring to the table a little bit. So, allow me to rationalize it. I'm going to show you in application on some things that maybe could give you perspective. So, I use some epics in a lot of content. Think about Geomancer and Iron Twins. I think about using Seer in a lot of my wave clear content, such as the first 2 rounds of Ice Golem on hard 10, or even through any of them for that matter, because there's always at least 2 rounds, and then you have the boss. Spider, I actually still use her here too as well. She's kind of like my catch-all in case I need to explode the last little remainder of the ads. As a matter of fact, I'll just do a run real quick so you guys can kind of see it. But basically, there are some epics that are still being used, and to noteworthiness, Seer, Geomancer. I'd even give a nod to a couple of the ones that may have some value. They're still used, right? I mean, it's not all just straight up epics or straight up legendaries or mythics nowadays, although it can be. There's still some comps where you could still see that magic still shine with that epic in particular. Now, I think at first when you're looking at the stat value for someone like Seer, yeah, the extra crit damage sounds nice. The extra, stats, it sounds really, really good because like they're going to be able to pack more of a punch, and that's great. But here's the thing. When we start looking at teams where you have a need, or like when you're going and you're progressing through like a late game to end game, the way I've always rationalized it when it comes to my audience, and I tell people like how you define yourself in the game. I did a video on it many moons ago. A part of that was not only establishing, late game is like establishing your teams and having a solid, consistent, which means that there's low failures, if any at all, to switching that to in-game being able to not only do that consistently, but now you have efficiency on top of that, so speeding up the runs, right? So one thing I wanted to kind of bring to the table is, and I'm going to use my similar premise. I have my clear team along with some boss killers, for the lack of better words. I'm going to do a quick run here. The goal for Seer, and this is literally where her use is at, is that she clears the teams and then she dies and she falls off. Empowering those champions gives you that extra stat blow. So think about it this way: 40% more HP, 40% more defense, which means that she's a lot more tankier. Now, I haven't rebalanced my team since they did the stat blow for blessings, which is a whole nother conundrum. But by this point right here, I want my Seer to be done. Like, I want her to fall off. She wants to plop on the floor, take a reps, take a nap, whatever works for her, right? But I basically want her to do that. I want her to be out of the picture, and that's it. And at this point, I pretty much only want my Stultus and maybe my Mithrala to kind of help get us through the finish line a little bit more closer. The more tankier you have your champions that are used in this essence, the more likely the chance is that you're not having them die off as fast as you want them to, which increases your likelihood of having a run. So for my late game, more experienced players that are going into end game, I would start with saying caution. Adding more stats to the survivability of champions can be a blessing or a curse, depending on how you look at it. Now, I am talking about the cons in some aspect when it comes to like Seer, being a perfect example here. You know, like for example, Lydia and Yumiko, since they're kind of a little bit more beefier. My Yumiko is kind of designed for PvP. My Lydia, the stat blow she got recently, another Star Switch, gave her extra HP and defense alone. You know, it just made her tankier, so she's harder to kill, right? So I'd have to tune her stats down to make her a little bit more there. Having the Seer also in play could add an extra turn where she's still alive a little bit longer, which means that you're losing time efficiency, especially if you're farming turn attack or if you're trying to farm basically like speed farm so that you can get the most out of it. Like say for instance we got like a speed event coming up soon. You wanna get these runs as many as you can done, completed successfully, and adding more time to that takes a little bit on the end, right? So if you're trying to hyper farm in a particular form of content, this could propose a problem for it. Now, before I just be all negative Nancy here, I'm not gonna just straight up say that this is a immediate no. I think that the blessing it far outweighs the cons. I think at the end of the day, if you have to deal with a empowered champion that's more efficient at being able to pop and do what they need to do, but they live a little longer, I can live with that myself personally, but that's a preference thing at that point. You have to understand and set that expectation for yourself realistically. Now, for the players that are, I know I talked about late game and end game players, for the early game players to mid game players and onwards, depending on how your account's growing, what you get in terms of lucky pools and the whole 9 yards, you actually have benefits. So, in the same realm of things, maybe you don't have that unkillable champion team set up in your clan boss, and you have that Geo, for example, but you're running a traditional team where, you know, being tanky is the name of the game. This actually proposes a good value where, like, now being tanky actually plays to your benefit, right? Having those additional stats plays to your benefit. I'm going to go ahead and flip it. I was watching this from Hell Hades, and I had to give a nod to him, too. One of the areas that I even myself gave it a try a long time ago, my gear is a lot more progressed, my team is a lot more efficient now, so I don't use them in general, but, like, I'll give a nod to one, for example, that I could never get working properly, which was, like, Royal Guard. And the reason why is he's squishy. That was one of my biggest issues. Like, yeah, I do have an enemy max HEV hit that hits all enemies, and it's nice, and that's fine and dandy. Maybe he can get some decreased speeds and some attack out there, or decreased defense out there. But it's pointless if he's constantly dying, right? Even with protection and mitigation that's laced inside the team, he was just flopping over because he's by nature squishy. But imagine what happens if you add 40% on top of that. Then the conversation kind of goes that you have a little bit more viability of being able to introduce these champions into terrains where they're a little bit harder to keep alive. So I want to kind of point that out because it is important to note that depending on the situations and how you're using them, there are some caveats where having them be tanky could be viable. I'll give another example. We were talking about Dragon for one, and this is where I'm going to kind of flip it, and we're going to talk about some champions that I would consider empowering and not empowering after the round. But I have done teams before when I've done some takeovers very early on when I first started playing the game, and I was requested to build a faster team, was to use some champions like Dark Kale, who you get from Doom Tower. And like, one of the things that still works inside Dragon is like poisons and poison explosions, which he does. You know, he's able to do that with his A1 set up with the A3. He can technically provide himself a little bit of security of survivability with decreased attack. I have used him in place of Stultus as a plug and play in. Imagine being able to find some equivalency of being able to empower those champions, which I believe there is going to be a list that's going to be exposed for like time limited champions that you can't get duplicates of. So maybe champions like those where like they could be a viable alternative to champions like Stultus if you don't have them. Rest assured, you can go farm for Dark Kale and then you have an option there, right? That is something that I would say could add to the viability of a champion. Now, keep in mind, it's not just the base stats that we're looking extravagantly for. Think about it this way: Demitha, a champion that Some of her speed tunes, especially early on, require a hefty amount of speed that you may not have access to. But what if you pulled some shards and you were going aggressively, trying to pull some champions, and you got a couple Demythas along the way? That extra plus in empowerment may give you the extra speed now, where that 10 gap that was giving you a little bit of difficulty, now it gives you a little bit more viability, right? The same thing is also true for like speeding up and going in some aggressive areas. There was a good friend of mine who's also a part of my community who kind of had a interesting perspective about it, and I'm going to give him a little knock because he said he got outsped by one, but champions that also have like high base stats in general, now you can add another 10 on top of that. Maybe for early game progression, you're able to use this champion to your advantage to boost ahead, you know? Like, it gives you more range of option, and that's what I'm excited to express for players that are growing, you know? And think about it this way too, like, where can stats benefit you? So if you're trying to get more output, obviously empowerment is going to help you. If you're trying to get more tanky, that's definitely going to have some value. So like supports are going to be very valuable. And I'm going to just skim through a couple of like the different factions, and I'm just going to break down some areas that I think like maybe you could see some potential in. And a lot of what I'm going to suggest is one piece of many different sides of the puzzle. There's always so much diversity in this game, which is why I think it's so successful, that this is not a end-all be-all list. This is not the holy mantra. This isn't the tablet of stone that's completely solidified. There's always going to be room for expansion as new champions come in, as old champions maybe get buffed and revitalized. You're going to see the viability expand. But I am going to point out some key ones. So in Bannerlords, there's one that actually kind of shows up a lot, especially for accounts that are progressing. If you so happen to get lucky with like a Warcaster, very similar to Demytha. He's actually plug and played into a lot of clan boss comps. Believe it or not, there are some teams that incorporate him along with someone else to do like Iron Twins, which is a mid to late-ish game function that you get big payoff, and it's even more important as you progress later in the game because of blessing power. He's actually suitable in those comps. Being able to use him as a block buff champion in Hydra, for example, another thing that you can technically use if you have you got to use the options available to you, right? So there are some champions that do stuff like that are very valuable, right? So he's one of them. Another thing I would say too, like Stag Knight, he has found himself viable in almost any content where you need decrease defense and attack. Pretty much every place where there's waves. Using him for control in terms of decreased speed. Fire Knight, that's one area that he's kind of shown in both normal and hard. There's team comps that he was incorporated into. So I could see like bringing up his stats gives him value in that department too as well. Faction Wars, obviously. Those are some big champions I would say right off the rip that automatically get like a good nod towards them because the empowerment gives them even more efficiency. So easy W, right? Now, I'm going to go ahead and browse through a little bit more here just to see if there's anything. You guys don't see him, or he's kind of like a little bit under the radar. Neldor, who I talked about in various different outlets for like alternative options for Fire Knight Hard, since freeze is a big key. Decreased speed helps out with controlling the boss too in terms of like turn meter manipulation. His A1, that freeze gives it to you. There's some good things there. Having him empowered means that he can maybe pack more of a punch, and he'd be better equipped to not only support getting you through the Fire Knight Hard content, but you can also do some decent damage with him, right? Or the speeds, you know? Fire Knight Hard's pretty taxing, right? We already gave a nod to Royal Guard. That's obviously a no-brainer. Someone that does a lot of good damage. I mean, I used them in my Spider comp for hard early on. Really, really good way to give you an idea of, like, getting more out of them, right? So there's some wins there, right? I'm actually going to go ahead and skip down a little bit here. I don't want to go through every single list, but I do want to point out some key ones. I will say hesitantly, and this will depend on where you're at in the game. Obviously, I have a big love for Seer. You see her using almost all my comps in terms of like speed runs and doing things of that sort. So having her empowered does the extra stats. So the HP, not really necessary because you're pretty much going to go in, go ham, go home, right? So not really crazy there. The attack, outside of the A1, the A3 does not scale off of attack. It's actually the crit damage based off of it's crit damage times buff count that's being utilized. And then enemy max HP associated to it, like so that's kind of how that full. I don't know the full breakdown of the entire stats, but basically the most important part about her stat bloat wise is pretty much the crit damage aspect of it in terms of like stat values, right? So the crit damage is nice there, but all the other stats don't really give her too much in that regard. The extra speed, complementary if you're trying to catch up a little bit more or get a little bit ahead. Typically, most Seer way clear teams don't require your Seer to go ridiculously fast. You kind of get that naturally with like who they're partnered with. Think Lydia, for example, who does increased speed with it. With her being the debuffer of the team. So she's got some really good synergies that don't really require her to have like exponential stats. The accuracy actually would be one of the ones I'll give an important nod towards, because a lot of stat checks for a lot of teams early on actually do get diffed by these two particular stats. So having the increase in speed and accuracy by 40 is not actually bad. Think about it this way. That's half a Great Hall. Not bad. Not bad at all. The crit damage, of course, being complementary. The crit rate also make it complementary, especially since we got a lot of sets that give, like, variable stats. Think Slayer. Not bad. I think for the most part, like I said before, the stat values and the gains that you get for your character far outweigh the cons, but it is still something to be aware of, you know? So I definitely give her a nod. I think for me personally, I'm still going to empower her. I may do a retune on her just to see if I can still lower her defensive and HP stats so that she's still kind of squishy while still getting that value out of the damage. Nevertheless, still a little bit of an uphill battle, something to keep in mind. Let's go ahead and move on to another champion that we could kind of broadcast about. So I think obviously it's a no-brainer that, like, Maneater, very similar to like your Demythas, having the extra speed, especially for like double Maneater, when you're going into the faster 2-1 comps, they could benefit from the extra speed. That's automatically a W as to why you should go for it. But since they're particularly tailored towards like clan boss, where you're trying to get damage output, the base stats complement that. There's no loss there. Now, I will say this, caution, because a lot of speed tunes, if you're only using one for like budget Maneater, for example, HP is a factor in terms of how you have your prioritization of who gets targeted. So if you do not have Maneater, I don't think Maneater intrinsically is the stun target. It's the slow boy of the budget Maneater team. Having him higher in terms of HP could be a bit of an issue. So my clan boss users, if you're using budget Maneater, I would be very careful with that, because that could be a little bit more harder for you to accomplish for your slow boy, your stun target, and that could mess up your tune a bit there. But in other areas, like, for example, Clan Boss, if you have a fully oiled double Maneater team or Bat Eater, or something, insert all the random teams that exist there, then him having more stats just makes him hit harder, which means he's more effective at being able to give you that one key, right? So, plug and play based off of your options, as always. There's pros and cons in it, right? I will give a nod that, like, for example, for people who were using him way, way back in the day, Urgrim, he was actually one of the first go-to solo dragon boss killers. And having the extra stats, which I think some of his kit got nerfed and it got brought down to earth, and it was a little bit harder to incorporate him as that. And better options came along. Think Theodore, Nishak, Tomb Lord, I think might have been one as well. Battle Khazar, one of the other OG ones. They kind of became better because of the stat values that they brought to the table. You know, legendaries versus epics. There's obviously going to be a discrepancy in favor of legendaries. Well, with empowerment, that kind of brings him up a little bit to a point where he may be another option to bring back to the table nowadays. I may be overestimating the plus 40%, but I mean, like I said, 40% is pretty hefty. If you look at like your Great Hall, for example, that's almost the equivalent of like two 10x10s, you know, for your bonuses for affinity. That adds up. And you know how you guys have been hearing me. I've been talking about doing the challenges and all that stuff for like, you know, arena, and the importance of getting your Great Hall up and running. It's an understatement, right? So giving him some flexibility in that direction makes him another viable option. It brings it back to life, so to speak, and that's something to consider. Seeker, and to be honest with you, I'm pointing out a lot of like clan boss teams because outside of being speed tuned, pretty much the rest of their stats are pretty easy to manage, right? So as long as they're speed tuned and they hit their skills at the right time, they're pretty much good to just inject a lot of damage and a lot of stats, for lack of better words, which is where you get that compliment from. I will add that like survivability for epics that are still kind of viable. I'm kind of pointing out Husk here, where, you know, outside of being able to do pretty good damage, which scales off of his, you know, crit damage, it's another enemy max HP hit. He is an HP-based champion that has base attack. He still gets all that buff stat that helps him out, still be effective at doing what he does for Hydra, but you still get it. You know, you still get that gain. So there's a lot of pros, right, as well. Let's see. Is there anybody else we want to talk about that might be worthwhile? I think for the most part, like champions. Let's get a little more niche with it. Vogoth, who was an option that I think was kind of considered for areas where like what is it, Dreadhorn, Baumel, I believe, or Burengiri, or Lady Annabelle. Those guys that were used. I think Lady Annabelle was already kind of good as she is because of the way her kit works and the way she's able to keep herself alive against those type of fights. Whereas like champions like Burengiri, for example, they struggle to fully sustain themselves and keep themselves alive, and they burned out a little too much towards the end, right? Well, with that stat gains, that opens the door for this to still now exist inside that same. So another option to be plugged and played into. I think Taragi was another one that might have been up for consideration, but I believe Burengiri was one of the big ones. Lady Annabelle, because they benefited from things dying. So when the bombs were exploding in Bomba, I think you got a little bit of regeneration back. So giving the complimentary stats to make sure he has that extra overhead to keep himself going is pretty much kind of the name of the game there for them, right? So that kind of the empowerment is good. I think it's a good thing. And the way I look at it is early game, mid game players are going to be limited on what they have anyways. But mid game to late game, as your champion pool is expanding, and you get duplicates and whatnot, that opens the door to really allow you to have an option that may have been somewhat lackluster because of the stat values that they had. They were just a little limited. Removes that, and now you have that as an option. I think that's pretty good. With that being said, I do believe that all the Doom Tower champions that can't be summoned, they're going to have their equivalent listing there, so be on the lookout when they do the update. I believe it's going to go live tomorrow as a part of the Fusion. You're going to see a good bit of champions that are going to be listed here that are specifically special for it. But when you do, you'll be able to plug and play those champions in there as well. So let me know what you guys think. I actually think that for right now, I'm on the yes train. Oh, I'm gonna give one more nod, and this one's just to spite some of the boys that talk crap about him. But I use still to this day the GOAT against Torment, Inquisitor Shamael, and literally he's there just to remove fears, right? And outside of that, he does complementary damage. He just does damage, right? So having the stat bloat on him just makes him even more effective. So I'm actually looking forward to. I'm gonna try to empower him, and I think maybe Seer, maybe Geo along the way. I'm gonna get those guys up and running and see if we can get like a lot of output from him and see if it improves the experience in like Hydra and other areas of the game a lot more. And just think about it this way: if you are one of those type of people that likes to pull a lot of champions and you're running out of space, which has happened, this is a great way to consolidate a lot of your lists. I went from using a lot of champions as food to immediately locking down my champion pool, and I'm just going to wait. I'm going to wait until I have empowerment, and then I'm probably going to be pushing a lot of them up into empowerment. See, like you see, I got like 3 Berengaris right here besides the main one, which I think he's not even fully ascended or anything. Yeah, it's my 5 one there. So I got a +3 waiting for me. That might be the enticement I need to fully take him up to 6-star and use him, you know? Like, there's so much that you can get out of this. So I want you guys to talk to me about this. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below what you guys are planning to use. Is there a particular champion that I didn't mention that could be really good? I didn't want to go through like the whole list and break down every single epic that you should or shouldn't use. I think epics that are great but maybe have issues surviving and you do need them to survive, automatically a yes. Champions that do their job and you want them to die later on, maybe a no. Take it in consideration whenever you're making your builds and you're building up your teams, right? But overall, I think this is a healthy inclusion for the game. I do think that it adds some, surprisingly, and I'll be real with you, I wasn't expecting them to do this. But the fact that they did just means that, okay, maybe it opens some doors, you know? Maybe that Rector that you are crutching off of right now has a little bit more survivability built onto her. Maybe a little bit more speed, so she's a little more faster in these fights. I can't see it anything other than being an overall W. But you let me know. Is there anything I missed? Let me know, and like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you guys are thinking about this experience overall. I'm really excited for this update to come out. And with that being said, always remember, stay ascended.
So it's 100 on the